Well, thank you and welcome back today. This is our third class, and today what I had planned that we would talk about is self-rule, the English tradition, and how that then will lead us to a countdown to the American Revolution. So Cicero and I are here and we are ready to march right on through it all. Whenever I'm talking about how the English colonies in North America begin to develop their own sense of identity, I always start off with the fact that, the English crown, when it gets involved in colonization in North America, and we were talking a little bit last week about those early years, Jamestown being the first permanent colony, 1607, which is why the Virginians always boast that they were the first, all the way through 1735, which is when Georgia, as the final 13th colony, is founded. So you've got a period of about 125 years or so that we are colonizing. What's interesting is the English response to North America and colonization really is sort of an afterthought. The Spanish are here first, the French come in, and then the English come in. And I always tell everyone, I love the English colonial history because England just sort of says, oh my gosh, everybody's establishing colonies in the New World, we need to get on it too. And they don't have necessarily a blueprint, and they don't have a vision for what colonization is going to look like. And as we were finishing up last week, I mentioned, so there's no cohesive, no comprehensive plan. It's pretty clear with the Spanish that what they're interested in is God, gold, and glory. They need tremendous amounts of money. They will obtain tremendous amounts of money based on their exploration into the New World, so much so that it actually destroys their nation. They will end up with no middle class, and you have a wealthy class of grandes, and then you have peon or peasant, and there's no one to keep the economy stimulated. So that tremendous amount of early wealth destroys Spain. Spain is the most powerful nation in all of Europe in the 1490s. By 1588, they're no longer the most powerful. France was the second most powerful nation on the continent, but France looks at exploration and looks at their presence in the New World more as a source of raw materials, trading posts, fur trading, exploration and claiming things for the crown and for religious faith. But the truth of the matter is that France of the 1400s and the 1500s is less focused on a cohesive religious story. By the 1500s, while Martin Luther has begun to talk about the problems in the church and it splits the Roman Catholic Church, France is undergoing its own religious war, the Three Henrys. You have that compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism. Spain stays devoutly Catholic, but their economy falls apart and they will sink into relative obscurity and have not been a major world player since the 15th century. France is looking at sources for economic development and raw goods, but the English have something totally different in mind, but they're not very organized about. They want to establish permanent colonies. It's an overflow. It's almost like the steam kettle gets so full with population growing in the British Isles, that having a place for second and third sons and their families to come to becomes incredibly important, but there's no particular design, so that you have Pennsylvania becomes the Quaker colony, lots of religious toleration, no slavery. Jewish families are not only welcome, but they are actually encouraged and incentivized to come to Pennsylvania. Virginia, of course, starts out with Jamestown as a chartered colony, but they almost starve to death because they also start out with no one is in charge. Everybody's going to join together. They're all going, it's kind of the kumbaya story. Everybody's going to join hands and be happy, and everybody will work together, but nobody's in charge deciding how they're going to work. And they literally, as as history tells you, the winners of hard times, they almost starved to death until John Smith gets there. And John Smith is not a particularly nice guy. He's a privateer, he's a former war hero, but he also knows how to give orders, and he puts in place, you don't work, you don't eat. And Virginia then will eventually become a much more profitable colony because hard work will be incentivized by extra land being given to you, and you make money. And of course, the Virginians will discover from their Indian counterparts, their native counterparts, tobacco, and will become quite wealthy, eventually exporting that. You look at somewhere like Maryland, where it's the Roman Catholic haven. You look at all across the colonies, there's no one distinct pattern. And that has an awful lot to do with why we develop the way that we do. I always tell people, if you think about it, if you saw my post on Facebook, it is a period of benign neglect from the time that Jamestown is founded in 1607 until you get to about mid 1700s, mid 18th century. And part of that's because England, who is our mother country, is undergoing a period of incredible chaos. So I'm going to kind of walk you through things that you probably remember from having had world history or Western civilization, whichever that you had. But when you begin to think about what all happens in England, you can sort of understand how they allow the colonies to just develop on their own because they didn't have time to fool with us. And you and I both know that if you allow your children to develop without any particular guidance, there's a wide range of how their behavior may end up being. They may end up being inherently saintly children, or they may be really difficult to deal with, probably more likely. So let's think about with English history for a while. So 1603, Elizabeth dies. Now, Elizabeth has been on the throne for the longest period of time in English history. It's kind of funny when you think about Elizabeth first coming to the throne, you think of all the chaos that Henry VIII had created for his nation once he discovered, and we were talking last week when we ran out of time, you know, he goes through 6 wives trying to get an heir to the English throne because England had not since medieval time had a female leader. Henry is convinced he has to have a strong male heir, marries 6 times, 3 children, eldest child Mary, who will become Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Catholic, daughter number 2, Elizabeth, who will become Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who is, of course, executed for adultery, witchcraft. Anne had a 6th finger on her left hand, which is one reason why Elizabethan costumes, the sleeves all came down to the tips of the fingers, was to hide that. That was considered to be a symbol of witchcraft. Of course, we know that's not true. It's more a symbol of inbreeding between royal families. He finally, with wife number 3, gets a son who will be Edward, who will become Edward VI, the first heir after Henry VIII dies. But Edward is sickly. He rules only for a period of 6.5 years, Protestant, raised by his mother's family, the Seymours. So you have Henry VIII dies. You have, for a short period of time, Edward VI on the throne, who is going to be Protestant. He dies. Mary I comes to the throne. She is devoutly Catholic. That's why she's called Bloody Mary. She will begin to execute Protestant leaders because she is going to restore England to the Holy Roman Catholic Church. She feels like they have lost their way. She's on the throne until her death, and then she dies and Elizabeth comes to the throne. Elizabeth is on the throne for over 40 years. Elizabeth is much more pragmatic. You know, I think I may have mentioned last week, Elizabeth will maintain the Church of England, the Anglican church that her father had started, but she will also say, I want no window into the soul of my subjects, meaning what you do in the privacy of your home, what you believe personally, I don't care. Well, Elizabeth, you know, that's a period of prosperity. There's a reason why that's called the Elizabethan Golden Age. That's the age of Shakespeare. That's the age of Francis Drake and others exploring the world. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful time for England, because with peace often comes prosperity. Elizabeth had been so concerned that if she married, the tradition of men being in charge, that if she married, her husband would automatically become the ruler of England. That, Mary I had been married to Philip II of Spain, probably more than you want to know, but Mary had been married to Philip II of Spain. When Mary dies, Philip II tried to ask for Elizabeth's hand in marriage, and Elizabeth put him off until she could no longer be sort of sweet and say, oh, I'm in mourning for my beloved sister, which was a bit of hooey since she and Mary were not quite that close. When it became pretty obvious to Philip that Elizabeth was toying with him, of course, he will decide that he's going to convert England back to Catholicism by force, and that will be in 1588, the launching of the Spanish Armada. Imagine Philip II, who believes that God has chosen him to bring England back in to the Catholic fold, and he sends out the Armada, the great Spanish fleet, to bring England by force back into the Catholic fold, and the majority of the fleet is destroyed by storm, by gales, by horrible winds and everything. And Philip will, for the next 10 years of his life, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the demise of Spain, will take to the Escorial, which is a monastery / palace. And the diaries, the records tell us that for the rest of his life, he wore horsehair shirts under his robes, and he each day whipped himself with a cat of 9 tails, because he believed that in some way he had displeased God, and that was why God had not allowed the Armada to be effective. Elizabeth, because of that history, chooses to never marry, which allowed her to be that strong, independent ruler. But what it means is when she dies in 1603, there is no heir. She is the last of the Tudor dynasty. And as they begin to look around, they have to go all the way back to what was her great-grandfather to decide what happens to the throne. And the nearest living relatives, because their great-grandfather had been a brother to her great-grandfather, are the Stuarts of Scotland. Now, all of you have probably grown up on the stories of reading Mary, Queen of Scots, or you've read about Bonnie Prince Charlie. In fact, my first major crush as a young girl was on Bonnie Prince Charlie. It took me a while to realize he had been dead 300 years, but the dead are so much easier to love than the living sometimes. But Elizabeth dies, and James I, who had been James VI of Scotland, will come to the throne. Now, Elizabeth had known prior to her death that that's probably what was going to happen. So she had been exchanging letters with James. Why is all this important? Because Elizabeth basically had been very pragmatic in her rule. Not only as you begin to plan for colonization, Roanoke colony 1598 had occurred during Elizabeth's rule. Elizabeth was already looking outward, expanding England, making England a much more dominant power. By the time she dies in 1603 and James I comes to the throne, James I comes to the throne, and he comes with the idea that he is a divine right monarch. Instead of Elizabeth, who might have controlled the English Parliament, but she did it in a very savvy way of saying, if there was a major issue, she would call together the leading lords of the realm and say, here's the problem we're facing. Here's what I think we should do. But I am but your queen. I am a woman. What do you think? And she was always pretty much able to persuade them to do what she wanted them to, but they felt as though because she had given them an audience and allowed them to talk through it all, that it had been their idea. That's critical to think about. James I will come to the throne, and by 1607, he will call together the English Parliament, and he basically will say to them, you have no power. The English Parliament has no power. I am your king. This is a divine, God has chosen me. And he actually, in a speech, you ought to pull it up at some point and read it. Look for James's speech to Parliament. He says, just as, God is the head of the church and the people are the body, I am the head of the government, you are the body. He goes through, I am the husband and you all are the wife. He goes through this whole thing basically saying to the English lords who have now enjoyed a history of 400 years since the Magna Carta of having a voice in government. So this period of time, almost simultaneous with the founding of Jamestown and English history, it's just no wonder they weren't thinking about what we were doing here in the colonial realm, because things are just not pretty in England. So think for a minute. Magna Carta, June the 12th, 1215, Runnymede, you've got the English lords, you have John I, who is forced to sign the Magna Carta, but it had said, no man is above the law, including the monarch. It had said no taxation without representation. And it had also advanced the idea of habeas corpus being, I look at Christina, I'm the monarch, she is, a noble within my realm, and I don't like what she's saying and she's doing. I just have her arrested, I have her thrown in a dungeon. English law didn't allow that. Continental law did. In France, Spain, the German provinces, the Italian provinces, Eastern Europe, if you spoke out against the crown, you disappeared. English law said under habeas corpus, you had to know the reasons why you had been in prison. And there had to be, by the 1300s under English tradition, there was a right to trial by jury of your peers. You had a right to be represented. Now, does that mean that no one was ever thrown in the dungeon without cause? Of course not. People were all the time, but the tradition was there. So Elizabeth dies, James comes to the throne, and he suddenly announces that there's going to be no power in England for the individual English citizens. It leads to all sorts of conflict, and I'll try to walk you through it real quickly. James I, really probably the only positive thing that he did, most people believe, is that he will convene a religious council, half leaders of church, half secular scholars, to do a new translation of the Bible, which becomes the King James Version of the Bible. And for many of us, that's the text that we grew up with. And when you read it, it is so Elizabethan English. It reads like something out of Shakespeare, or Shakespeare reads like something out of the King James Version of the Bible. But there's going to be almost complete chaos while James I is on the throne. The 30 Years' War is raging across Europe. It is a war really between Protestants and Catholics, and James will try to stay out of it. But the Scots, even though John Knox, who founds the Presbyterian Church, is Scottish, because the Stuarts, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been raised in France as a member of the French court. The Stuarts are going to be, if not openly Catholic, they are certainly going to be very, very sympathetic to Catholicism. James I dies by 1625. His son Charles I comes to the throne. Charles I immediately sets about even more restricting the rights of Englishmen, so much so that by 1628, the Parliament refuses to give him any money. They control the purse strings. There's a message in there. Whoever controls the purse strings does have a lot of power. And they basically say to him, unless you back off on this, you're ruling alone, you get no money. Whatever you want, then you need to pay for yourself or just do without. And they force him in 1628 to sign something called the Declaration of Rights, which is really a reiteration of the Magna Carta and what had become the tradition of English rights through the common law. He will sign it, and then he will come back later and say, well, I didn't really want to sign it. I only signed it under duress, which is generally how people sign peace treaties. Usually they sign it because somebody has a gun, or in this case, a bag of coins at their head. it will end up with absolute civil war. So how many of you remember reading or remember in class talking about the English Civil War, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers? That wonderful image, Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads with their little short bobbed haircut, and the Cavaliers, which were based on the way that Charles I looks, the long wavy. In fact, if you've seen the mascot of the University of Virginia, he is a Cavalier. That is Charles I. The high knee boots, the long curls, the spiky beard, all of that. Well, English Civil War will come into being, massive civil fighting across all of England into Scotland, and it will end in 1649 with the execution publicly of Charles I. I stopped for a moment there because that's a major turning point in all of European history, but especially in British history, because up until that point, there was a belief for most people, England was the only one that was a little bit different, but if indeed you believe in divine right monarchy, you believe that God controls everything that's happening, and therefore those who are born into those royal families are preordained or destined by God to rule, and to then, especially because they're crowned usually by for England, the Archbishop of Canterbury crowns the King or Queen of England. So to rebel against the king or queen is in effect to rebel against God. Well, not only do they rebel, and there is this civil war that lasts for a period of over 10 years, but at the end of it, the Roundheads capture Charles I. Charles I will not acquiesce. They do not want him to go into exile, because if he goes into exile, there's always a chance he can come back, and they decide to execute him. Regicide, which is the execution of a monarch, homicide for a person, matricide for a mom, fratricide for a brother, whatever. Regicide, the killing of your monarch, didn't happen. And so it shocked Europe all to the core. What's interesting, which adds to the chaos in England that allows the American colonies to be on their own, is that Oliver Cromwell then becomes Lord Protectorate. Those of you that have seen Monty Python, there's a wonderful song about Oliver Cromwell in Monty Python. He becomes Lord Protectorate, and England is turned into basically a Protestant Roundhead, in theory a republic, because he's not king, he is chosen. But it becomes in many ways more dictatorial than it had been under James or Charles, either one, and certainly more than it had been under Elizabeth. All theaters are closed. Wearing of the color of red is banned. No drinking, no gambling. Everyone had to be in church. If you were not in church, you were fined or you could be imprisoned. It becomes literally a Protestant republic, but it is a very controlled. For many of the citizens of England, it became sort of the flip side of what had been their problem before, too much control by the crown. Cromwell stays in the protectorship from 1649 until 1658 when he dies. And interestingly, when he dies, he leaves record that his son Richard should become the next Lord Protectorate. Well, that smacked too much of monarchy, and you're going to have Parliament coming together, and they send a message to Charles II, son of Charles I, who is living in exile in France, and they basically say, Charles, we're really sorry about this thing about having killed your father. I mean, we know we chopped his head off, and that really probably was not a nice thing to do. But we've realized we shouldn't have done that. And we're in a bit of a mess now. And would you come back and rule? I always used to tell my kids, I would have gotten that invitation and I would have said, something's wrong with this. They're trying to get me back in the country, and they are going to grab me and they're going to chop my head off too. I guess I'm a suspicious person. Charles agrees to come back. And he will rule from 1660 until 1685. And it is absolute chaos, because he will then change policies. Catholics can now hold offices under the Puritan regime. You know, you had to be a Protestant and you had to be a Presbyterian, a Puritan, to be able to hold office. He just sort of throws things open, totally, again, begins to shut down Parliament whenever they disagree with him. He will just shut them down and send them home. And I mean, there's chaos for 25 years. He dies without heir. He is married, but he is notoriously a philanderer, but has no legitimate heir to the throne. He dies and the throne passes to his brother, James II. And James II had been married twice. First wife, Protestant, 2 children, marry his older daughter and the younger daughter. First wife dies. He married one of the French princesses, has a second marriage, and to that marriage in 1687 will be born a son, James Edward, who will be baptized Catholic. That puts James Edward in line with James II, who is in his late 50s, early 60s when he comes to the throne. That puts a Catholic in line for the throne, and the English people, English Parliament in particular, are not happy with that. So James doesn't finish out his term, his lifetime as monarch of England. Instead, the English Parliament will send a message to his elder daughter, Mary, who happens to be married to William of Orange, the Dutch Republic. They are Protestant, they're Reformed Dutch. They are also a republic form of government, you know, easier. They're small, 7 stateholders, 7 states, but they send a message to William and Mary and say, Mary, your father has gone crazy. They say it in a nicer way. We would like to invite the 2 of you, William and Mary, to come to England and to rule the country jointly. William and Mary choose to do so. I mean, England is a major dominant power. The Netherlands, while a strong economy, probably rivaling England and France, even though they're so tiny because of their shipping, is simply small. So they come, and as they arrive, James, actually, the story is, dresses in women's clothing and flees England and goes to France in exile, leaving William and Mary in charge. English Parliament has been through too much in this period of time. Think about this: in a period of only 75 years, Elizabeth has died, you've had 4 monarchs, you've had a civil war, you've had a Protestant protectorship, you've killed a king. There's this constant fighting over religion and who is most powerful, Parliament or the king. They're going to settle it once and for all. So 1688, William and Mary come to England, and it is the glorious revolution. No shots are fired, but William and Mary agree that in accepting the monarchy, they will sign the English Bill of Rights. And the English Bill of Rights includes a number of things, but at its core, it is 1, Parliament is supreme. The monarchy is there, but the monarchy, while they have a voice in what goes on, Parliament is supreme. They are not above the law, and the people are prime. And so English Bill of Rights, 1688, 1689, that's at the height of the final colonies. Georgia will be significantly less than the others. So by the 1690s, 12 of the 13 English colonies have been founded, but they've basically done their own thing. 1703, one of the things that William and Mary will do is they will unify England and Scotland together. With the Act of Union, England and Scotland become, for the first time, Great Britain. Up until then, it had been England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So England and Scotland are united. William and Mary will control the throne until 1706. Mary dies first, then William. And Mary's sister Anne comes to the throne. She dies in 1714. Why is that important? Because when Anne dies, Anne had, I'm trying to remember if it's 15 or 16 children, none of whom lived to adulthood. So she dies with no heir. Once again, they go back to the family tree, and the German Hanoverian family will be brought to England to rule. and George I comes to the throne, and George I never learns to speak English. Instead, he will depend almost entirely on Robert Walpole, who is the most vocal of all the ministers in the House of Commons. And in the way that the German language translates, Robert Walpole becomes the first minister, but it translates as prime minister. So for the very first time with George I, we have the prime minister of England with whom the majority of the political power will rest. But while all of this is being figured out, you know, they've paid very little attention to the colonies in the New World. So let's get ourselves to thinking about, while nobody's paying attention, how have the English colonies developed? Well, you know, we last year celebrated the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. There will probably be some ceremonies this year also, just because it takes us a couple of years to get commemorations out of our system. So we like to celebrate. When you think about, from the very, very beginning, how self-government and self-rule occurs in these English colonies, you have to go back to that very first landing. So the Mayflower gets blown off course, should have landed in Virginia where their charter was. Instead, they land in Massachusetts, which they really don't know what it is, but they know they're not where they're supposed to be. It's kind of like, I don't know where I am, but I know I'm not where I was supposed to be. And they create the Mayflower Compact. It is the first major document in the New World for these English colonies. And it is a document of self-rule. So there's 102 people on the Mayflower, men, women, children, some indentured servants. And of those, 41 are pilgrims, which means that they're basically Puritans. They're trying to create a heavenly kingdom on earth. Not quite as strict as you're going to find with the Massachusetts Bay Colony basically 10 years later. But we know that they decided that if they were going to get off the ship, they didn't have a charter to the land, and they needed to write something down that sort of gave them the authority. I love the fact that they needed something in writing that made it okay to do what they really didn't have much choice to do, and that was get off the ship. But we don't know for sure who wrote the Mayflower Compact. Most people think that it was probably one of the Puritans, a guy by the name of William Brewster. Those of you on who may have ancestors who you can trace your lineage back to the Mayflower, not me. Brewster was university educated, and the document reads, obviously, as something that someone who was well educated probably had written. Very, very short, 200 words, shorter than the Gettysburg Address, but it basically just sort of outlines specific principles. And it said, in effect, that the colonists could write and enact, and they use the phrase, laws, ordinances, and constitutions and offices for the general good of the colony. And that in doing so, they all agreed that they would abide by the laws, acts, constitutions, and general ordinances that were agreed upon by the men. Sorry, women didn't get a vote in that one, but by the men who were aboard the Mayflower. Interestingly, the two men who were indentured servants signed the Mayflower Compact. So it was not necessarily a document based on freedom or even the ownership of property. It was purely based on gender at that point and what they thought. That document will stay in effect in that colony until 1691. And at that point, they'll join the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But it's the first document in the New World establishing self-government, and that's an English tradition. Now, almost quickly on its heels, once you have the Mayflower, the Plymouth colony joining with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you know, we talk so much about people coming to the New World for religious freedom. Well, that was religious freedom as long as you believed the way that those who were in charge believed. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony didn't like anyone else interpreting what that environment should be like. And if you've read The Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Hester Prynne, you know, sometimes historical fiction's a wonderful sort of view. It may not be historically accurate, but the times, the culture, the society, it's a pretty accurate depiction. That's pretty much what the Massachusetts Bay Colony was like. It was a very closely guarded neighbor, judging neighbor, being brought before the church council if you were seen to be sinning in the broad or the narrow sense of sinning. Well, there were those people who didn't necessarily agree with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and some of the first group, Thomas Hooker and others, will leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and out of that will be founded Connecticut. That's important for us because with the founding of Connecticut, they are going to write their own document. It comes out of a sermon, actually, that Thomas Hooker delivered in church in their congregation in 1638. And it's the framework for their government. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is considered to be the first constitution in the New World. And it basically said that the fundamental rights of English people were implicit, and that was that the people had a right to choose the government under which they would live. Interestingly, that's similar to what you're going to see John Locke writing at the same time. Remember, John Locke talks about the right of the people to revolt. Two treatises on government. Locke says people have the right to overthrow a government that does not protect their inherent basic rights. Locke says life, liberty, and property. We will modify that a little in the New World. But the fundamental orders said that they had the liberty of speech through elected representatives, that they had the right to a secret ballot, the first time that that's going to be mentioned in the New World, that there was a rotation in office, a limitation on how long you could serve in a particular office, which is something we hear debated even today in reference to our Congress, and that there were regular elections that had to be held. So all of that is to say that while England is off over there dealing with civil war and all of this, what you have developing in this sort of unchecked new world, new colonies, is the development of a spirit that says we have the ability to govern ourselves. Now, part of that is, a lot of that is based on that English tradition, the Magna Carta, the right to trial, you know, all those things that are part of the English common law. Part of it also is a religious idea, because you will find in a lot of those early writings talking about man with a spark of divinity, man being mankind, a spark of divinity within us, that we are created in God's image, you know, that we have these rights that are given to us through natural law. Jefferson will reference that 100 years later when he is drafting the Declaration of Independence. And it's kind of interesting to see how these 13 colonies develop. Now, I would be less than honest if I didn't say it was a limited equality. So we can talk about fundamental orders. We can talk about, in Pennsylvania, the right of people to choose their elected officials. You know, in most of the colonies, there's a royal governor, but everything else is chosen by the people. It's a limited equality. There were no rights for women. There were no rights for people of color, male or female. And that we look back at and we go, you know, and it's hard with the lens of 2021 to look at that and understand that while it was a limited equality, there was no other region anywhere on the earth that had as high a proportion of the adult male population enjoying that freedom to choose their government, to own land, to vote, than in the 13 English colonies, more so than in England itself, certainly more so than on the continent. and certainly more so than you will find in the Spanish colonies in Central and South America, or you will find in the Asian kingdoms of that period of time. And that's important because it has a lot to do with why we have developed what so many people think of as the American character, and that is that strong sense of independence, that desire to not be told what to do. And part of that, you know, people will say, well, that's the Scots-Irish. It really is sort of a British Isles thing that is allowed to develop. The Spanish colonies are going to be very, very different than that. The French colonies are very, very different. And so what you're going to find is eventually, because you have the Spanish in Florida, you have the French in portions of Canada and the Ohio Valley, it is inevitable that conflict will occur between those three countries. I'm checking time. Okay. We'll start today. We'll do French and Indian War, and then we will be ready to do Countdown to Revolution next week. I'm going to try and do French and Indian War quickly enough that then maybe we can open it up and talk a little bit if you all have questions. So it's also important to remember that in that period between 1603 and 1750s, that there will be a series of what were considered to be at that point global wars, and the global wars being European continental wars, because for most of Europe was the center of the world. I mean, quite frankly, that's how they drew their maps. That's what they thought about. The fourth and the final of those wars is going to be the 7 Years' War, which occurs between the English and the French, and we will get the colonies sucked into that war. I always tell everyone, you know, the English, and I've already said that in this series of classes, the English and the French are always each other's best allies, except when they're in competition for the same sorts of things. So, you know, you have the 100 Years' War, the English are fighting the French, and that's Henry V making that wonderful speech about we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. You have the English and the French fighting each other in the 7 Years' War, which in this region in North America will be known as the French and Indian War. We are allies in World War I. We are allies in World War II. The French will come to the colonial aid, and we'll talk about that as we look at the countdown to the American Revolution and then French involvement in that. But the French are involved in supporting the colonies, not only because they love the idea of freedom and everything, but they also have a real problem with Britain, and they thought Britain was becoming too powerful. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But we'll talk about that more next week. So let's talk French and Indian War. How many of you have read Last of the Mohegans? Anybody read Last of the Mohegans? Any of you seen Last of the Mohegans? Oh my Lord, you need to watch Last of the Mohegans. Daniel Day-Lewis running through the woods with the wind in his hair. Absolutely fascinating. I say that because obviously Last of the Mohegans is historical fiction. But there's a wonderful scene in Last of the Mohegans, the Daniel Day-Lewis movie version, in which the daughter of the Scottish general who has come over with the Brits is talking to Hawkeye, the Daniel Day-Lewis character, and she says, you know, why are you all living on the frontier where you have no protection? Why would you do that? And he talks about the death of his parents, how, according to the Indian tradition, he believes that he sees them in the night sky, that they are the stars who look down over him. And he talks about land, how important the land is, that being able to have your own land, to have your own place. Well, that has a lot to do with the French and Indian War. So let's do the French and Indian War in 7.5 minutes. The roots for the war really rest in the early 1750s, when you have Pennsylvania fur traders and you have land-hungry Virginians. If you all have seen the Disney version of Pocahontas, ignoring those cliffside scenes where they're diving off the cliffs into the water of the Atlantic, knowing that there are no cliffs in Virginia. But anyway, there's that scene about land and gold and land and all of that. Well, you have land-hungry Virginians, you have fur traders in Western Pennsylvania that go into the Ohio Valley, Ohio River Valley, and they come into conflict with the French trading posts that are already there. The French drive the English colonists back, and then the French begin to double the effort to build a line of forts all the way from what today would be the Canadian border, all the way down through the Ohio Valley, their plan being to eventually build down in all the way into Kentucky, what would become later to Kentucky. A British delegation, there's a conflict, there's a question over, well, who owns that land? Why do the French own the land? Just because they at one point have colonies a little bit farther west, why do they have the right to everything that is west of the Allegheny, the Appalachian Mountains? So they send the American colonies, the Brits send a delegation to try and negotiate with the French. And as a member of that delegation, there is a 21-year-old by the name of George Washington. Now, George Washington goes along, not because he's made a name for himself at that point. I mean, he's a 21-year-old whose older brother, Augustus, is still, sort of in charge of the family, but Washington is a surveyor. So he's there because he can interpret the lay of the land. And as what they hope, they can come to a peaceful resolution over a division of the land. Well, that's not what happens. It really heats up. The delegation makes no progress. They are sent back. You have then the Pennsylvanians who attempt to build a fort in Western Pennsylvania. And by the way, Maryland, you're on here. That's when our ancestor Henry Sales, his first service in the French and Indian War he is at one of those Western forts in Pennsylvania as a part of that conflict with the French and the Indians. So, there becomes this conflict between the Pennsylvanians and the French who are building the forts because they have progressed that far south. There becomes a true fight. And the colonists, with support of the British, are attacked by French guerrilla fighters, predominantly Huron and other native tribes that have allied with the French, and they are very soundly defeated. When that happens, then things begin to heat up. French and Indian War, 1755, you've got General Braddock, who is English, is dispatched to Virginia. And he brings with him, it's kind of amazing, he brings with him this huge force of men, 45,000 troops. Now, in my mind, I've tried to figure out how many ships it takes you to get 45,000 troops. Part of them are going to be colonial forces, but an awful lot of them are going to be what are going to be referred to as the redcoats who come with them. England will make an investment, the equivalent of 90 million pounds. They are really angry at the French. I mean, they're already fighting them on the continent. They're going to just kick their tushes in the New World. That's not exactly what happens. And in fact, on the very, very first outing, the French and Indians are going to defeat this British army, 900 British casualties, including General Braddock. At that point, Prime Minister William Pitt, who is the new prime minister, decides they are going to ramp things up. They start sending more and more and more troops. And the war itself will last from 1756 until 1763. Series of fighting, and it really is all for control of westward expansion, the land. It is also a continuation of a fight between England and France in Europe, and they're fighting here. Now, what creates a problem for the colonists is that ultimately victories at Fort Niagara, Lake Champlain, and then Quebec City on the Plains of Abraham. I love that name. On the Plains of Abraham, General Wolfe will defeat the French. The British will take basically control of North America. The French will keep only that part of Quebec where they had a large number of forts, but the rest of Canada becomes British. All of what today we think of as the United States over past the mountains becomes British, and the French basically have lost any future in the New World. Peace of Paris, 1763, you know, they all have to get together and sign a peace treaty. No one wanted to sign a peace treaty in Philadelphia. If you're going to get together all the muckety mucks, let's go somewhere that there's fun and there's good food and there's nice things to see. So of course they meet in Paris, Peace of Paris, 1763. France ends up with basically 2 islands off the coast of Nova Scotia, some islands in the Caribbean. Great Britain takes all the land that I previously mentioned, and France is pretty much out of it. The problem is Great Britain now has expended this incredible amount of money, much to the chagrin of the American colonists who have fought alongside the British in the French and Indian War, because the American colonists are, I don't know why you sent so many troops over here. You all don't know how to fight anyway. There's this huge, the French and Indian War is that sort of crowning point of conflict between the way that fighting on the frontier differs from the way the British had fought. You know, there's a scene in Last of the Mohegans. The scene is actually documented in the historical record. The British every afternoon at 4 o'clock would call a ceasefire. They would ring the bells, call a ceasefire, and have tea. Well, that's not how fighting occurred on the frontier. You know, you didn't line up in a row and fight the way that you fought in continental Europe, there were rules of engagement, and you lined up and then everybody marched forward. First row took a kneel, and then someone would yell fire and both sides would fire each other. That's not how frontier fighting was. You know, the American colonists by that point have been here 150 years. They have learned to fight. They have learned to hunt. They have learned a wilderness guerrilla form of fighting, and you hide behind trees and you don't, you know, who says you can't launch a surprise attack? Who says you have to get both sides facing each other and then you count off and then you allow each other to fire? So coming out of the Peace of Paris, and we will do that countdown next week, what Great Britain will do is they're going to decide that they are going to recoup the cost of the French and Indian War by taxing colonists. Up until that point, very little taxation in the American colonies. What taxes that were imposed were local taxes that had been imposed by local assemblies for the building of roads and bridges and those sorts of things. And often those taxes were in the form of work. Probably all of you have ancestors who were here that if you go back, you will see where an ancestor was assessed 10 days of road building duty or 10 days of clearing land, those sorts of things. Suddenly Great Britain is going to begin to raise capital, raise money to reimburse Parliament for the cost of having fought the French and Indian War from colonists who don't believe that the English actually won that war, but believe that it was the colonial fighting forces that will win that war. All of this will come on the heels of the beginning of thought that had already occurred, that the colonists really didn't need the mother country. If the mother country was not going to allow them truly to be English citizens, then perhaps they didn't need to be a part of England. And I think most people are surprised to learn that in 1754, Benjamin Franklin, on the eve of the French and Indian War, as things are beginning to heat up, Benjamin Franklin had called the 13 colonies representatives together in Albany, New York. And 7 of the colonies showed up, and Franklin had proposed the Albany Union, which would have been a first step of the colonies coming together to create their own, in effect, a national government that would have been the stepping stone to declaring independence. 7 of those colonies show up, they agree, but then within months, the French and Indian War breaks out. Great Britain starts sending troops over, and the Brits decide that they're going to take control of the American colonies. And taking control after 5 generations of having very little control is going to set the stage for conflict. You know, all of us who are parents have always heard, if you don't train your children up in the way you want, don't think that you're going to be able to control them when they're 15 or they're 16 and they begin to challenge you, because at that point, your ability to impact their behavior is going to be so much less. The English colonies are indeed, or will become, the unruly children of the British Empire, because you weren't interested in us for 5 generations. And now suddenly you've seen the potential wealth. You've seen the beauty of the land. You've seen the significance of having this North American colony to check French and Spanish growth. And now you want to govern us. It's going to be a hard sell. And next week, what we'll do, oh my Lord, we're at 4:30. Next week, we will start with a countdown to the American Revolution. And it's one of my favorite classes of all times because, and I'll leave you with this tease, the very first thing that the British Parliament will do, 1763, they signed the Peace of Paris, the peace treaty, and then they announced the Proclamation of 1763 that says no colonist may move beyond the mountains, the Allegheny or the Appalachian Mountains, nor may they claim land. And those who have already moved beyond are now required to move back to the east. I'm here to tell you that for those of us who have ancestors who had already gone across those mountains, come and make me. I'm not giving up my land. That's what I came here for. That's the future of my children. The Dukes are up and we are ready to roll. We will do the countdown. It's amazing that it will take basically 12 years before the first shots are fired. That shows the attempt on the part of the colonists to come to a peaceful reconciliation, but it won't happen. I don't know where the time goes and I talk way too much, but this is just such exciting stuff. Your homework, watch Last of the Mohegans. You can get it off of YouTube. Just some of the philosophical statements, you can fast forward through the bloody torture sorts of things, but some of the philosophical statements about why would anyone have left Europe and have come to the colonies? Why would you take those chances? It's almost like the scene in Braveheart. All of you have seen Braveheart. Remember the scene when Mel Gibson with the half blue face and everything just simply screams, freedom. It's the same sort of thing, but it gives you that sense of, don't take from me what already now 5 generations of my family or 1 generation of my family has already taken the gamble to give me. So thank you all for being here today. I don't see anything in the chat box. It's probably because I've been talking so fast and furious you haven't even had time to think, but oh my Lord, isn't American history fascinating and fun and exciting? And I love you all for being here. Last of the Mohegans, The Crucible. We haven't even talked about the religious impact at this point, but I mean, there's some good books out there that you need to read. Go back and read Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God to get a sense of that Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Second Great Awakening. Even outside of Massachusetts, the power of faith and destiny and creating a heavenly kingdom on earth. Have a lovely day.